impacts also has innumerable co-benefits for biodiversity and for ecosystem services that people rely on, like drinking water, which I'll turn to more in just a minute. But as what this bill does, which we'll go into more in just a few moments, is to address the key drivers of these forest impacts. And most forest impacts really boil down to just a handful of key commodities. These include wood products like pulp and paper and lumber, rubber, soy, beef, palm oil, cocoa, and coffee being the major drivers. And of course, for the purposes of the bill that we're talking about today, these products don't just occur in a vacuum. They're driven very much by demand, including purchases from state governments, which are the drivers that we are addressing through this regulation. Next slide, please. Just to talk about some of the key terms in this bill. So in very common parlance, I think most people are familiar with the term deforestation. And we normally think of that as the term that sort of encompasses all forest impacts whenever trees are cut down. But actually, the meaning of deforestation is much, much more limited in actual policy implementation. What it really means is narrowly defined to apply only to the actual conversion of a forest to an entirely different land use type. So cutting down a forest and turning it into a cattle ranch or a palm oil plantation. What it does not apply to, and this has been the source of huge inequities in international forest policy and something that this bill gets to the heart of addressing, is it doesn't apply to industrial logging, particularly in the global north, where there's sort of this myth that if you cut down a forest but don't replace it with something other than trees, trees are renewable, they regrow, so the forest is still there. So you can entirely clear cut a forest, have just vast swaths of cleared land, nothing but stumps, and technically in international parlance, that is still a forest. And so that, of course, perpetuates this longstanding myth from countries like Canada, Sweden, and others that they have essentially zero deforestation, when in fact, Canada, for example, cuts well over 1 million acres of forest every year with very catastrophic impacts. So the impacts to forests would actually be from logging would be captured under the term forest degradation, which gets more to sort of structural changes, the reduction of value of the ecosystem, whether you're talking about carbon storage or biodiversity, regardless of whether or not the forest has actually been transitioned into a different land use. Next slide, please. So as already mentioned, we talked about the climate impacts, but of course, forest impacts aren't just devastating for the climate. Next slide, please. Forests are really biodiversity powerhouses. They hold more than 80% of all terrestrial biodiversity, particularly in tropical forests, where the number of species per hectare is just truly staggering. And even in northern forests, which are less biodiverse, hold really critical and iconic and at-risk species. For example, the boreal forest of Canada is called the North America's bird nursery because each summer billions of birds fly up there to nest and then fly south for the winter. So we see many of them in our backyards here in the United States. Really, really critical areas for species that really cover the world. The other impacts that this bill captures are impacts to human rights. So deforestation and forest degradation are very closely associated with really horrendous human rights violations. This includes land grabbing from indigenous lands, displacement, violence against forest defenders, exploitative labor practices, water contamination, just a whole swath of truly horrific impacts to people. And this is particularly true in the tropics, but also occurs in northern forests as well, where indigenous peoples don't necessarily have the right to determine the future of what happens on their territories. So what this bill, HB 5117, does is it builds in those protections for communities and people. So ensuring that things like land tenure rights and the right to free, prior, and informed consent, rights of workers, are all protected when it comes to the products that the Illinois state government is sourcing. Next slide, please. This bill, HB 5117, is really situated within a huge amount of global momentum around addressing forest impacts. Over the past 3 or 4 years, there's really been a groundswell of attention on the need to be reining in impacts to forests and tackling commodity-driven deforestation. So just last December, the international community at the annual climate conference coalesced around the need to halt and reverse deforestation and forest degradation by 2030 as absolutely essential to hitting our global climate targets. We now have a global biodiversity framework that talks about ending loss of biodiversity and loss of ecological, including forest integrity. And there's also this EU deforestation this EU deforestation regulation, the EUDR, that is supposed to go into effect at the end of this year, that really has been a paradigm shifting piece of legislation that addresses the EU's ties to deforestation and forest degradation. And unlike so many past measures, that actually does capture degradation alongside deforestation and integrates protections against those impacts. So the stage is really set for states to step up here in the US and provide leadership. And in fact, a couple of years ago, Colorado issued an executive order that addressed state procurement tied to deforestation and forest degradation in tropical and boreal forests. And this was really the first of its kind. But of course, that was an executive order, and it was more sort of advisory for state agencies. So there's now an opportunity for Illinois to really take that next step and align itself with where the international community is, where the EU is, and to build this into its actual requirements around its state purchases. I'll also add there are similar efforts that have been happening in California and New York. These got started a couple of years ago, and as Whitney mentioned, they applied only to tropical and to boreal forests. This was obviously very triggering for northern countries that are not used to be putting in the hot seat for their very real forest impacts. And eventually the boreal forest was actually removed from both of those measures. And the fight continues in New York to get sign-on from Governor Hochul, who actually vetoed the what's now called the Trees Act after it was signed into or passed both houses last year. So this is also occurring in the context of other state fights, but the Illinois bill is really out ahead in terms of its vision and leadership, and just perfectly aligned with where the international community is. Also mentioned there is a federal forest act that would address illegal deforestation as well. So yeah, there's a really tremendous opportunity for Illinois, and Illinois is perfectly positioned to do this, to be the first US state to pass a deforestation-free procurement bill, and one that looks at this issue from all lenses in terms of global impacts across the global north and the global south, builds in that equity, and also addresses the human rights implications of these sourcing practices across these commodities. So a huge opportunity. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Whitney.
Thanks so much, Jen. And I will acknowledge the background music. Hopefully it's not distracting or irritating. Jen mentioned this in an earlier slide, but I thought I would create one additional slide to just really bring to attention the 7 commodities that bill aims to regulate. The bill will also allow the implementing agencies to add any additional commodities that are linked to deforestation at their discretion, and in collaboration with experts on this issue. The 7 products, again, are any cattle product, so that includes beef, leather, dairy hasn't really come up much in conversation, but if there are dairy products that would be linked to a supplier that is getting them from cattle ranches that are contributing to deforestation or primary forest degradation, that would be off limits. Soy, cocoa, coffee, palm oil, and then again, rubber and any tree derivative products such as wood or paper that we commonly associate with tree products. So the Deforestation-Free Illinois campaign is supported by a very large coalition that includes local membership, national membership, as well as international membership. We, at the Illinois level, we have your wonderful chapter who signed on early, and we've had really great participation from a few of your members from the get-go. And we have the Illinois Environmental Council, which many of you know is a major gatekeeper in the Illinois state legislature. We have NRDC, of course, which Jen is representing. Sierra Club and Prairie Rivers Network are some of the top local endorsers, and we have a whole suite of organizations listed here. Many additional ones are likely to sign on in the near future now that the 2.0 version of the bill is getting ready to be shared among coalition members. Next slide. And so I'm just going to touch on what our Illinois campaign strategy as a whole has been really focusing on. One of the key differences between how we're moving ahead with the legislative strategy is working with the executive branch early on. California and New York had great success getting the bill passed in both the Senate and the House at the state level. And once it hit the governor's desk, eventually was vetoed either actively or inactively based on however their veto models work. And so something that we've been doing from the get-go is communicating early with the state agencies most implicated by the bill, working with them to address their concerns and their major needs, and providing them with the resources to start wrapping their heads around what it will look like to implement this bill once it does get passed. And then we know that the governor's office is very receptive to bills that the agencies who are primarily responsible for implementing them, if they don't have any red flags, the governor is much more receptive to bills that come across his desk. Another strategy that we've been working on is building an external education campaign as well as an internal education campaign. The coalition has monthly working group meetings, and we've just started integrating different presentations on topic areas implicated by the bill. So our support base is as educated as possible on the issue, and then building an external education campaign to reach groups like yours across the state and touch on these various topics. So we have a broad and strong and educated base of support within the state of Illinois. We are also working on facilitating and promoting interstate and intergovernmental organizing. I don't believe Jones mentioned this, but there's a policy handbook that is in the works to help different levels of government who we hope to support in mobilizing this issue within their own regions and government entities. And then we're also, as a part of our coalition building strategy, really conscious of the varying member expertise and different roles that everyone has to play based on what their organization is particularly focused on or has capacity for. And again, because this is such an international issue that spans a whole bunch of different interest groups and regions, we leverage this sort of broader coalition in informing our efforts, whether it be someone who has expertise on tropical forest issues, someone with expertise on boreal forest issues, people who have forest expertise at the US, and a whole bunch of other experts that we have pulled in to inform our efforts and strategy to get this moving forward and implemented. So this is a kind of high-level overview of all of the ways to support our campaign at this time. If any one of you or anyone in your network has the time and interest or expertise to support us on all of these, any of these action items, I'll go over the list and provide a little bit more detail as I cover it. And we would love to work with you on driving these action items. So the first one that I have highlighted is related to the educational campaign strategy mentioned in an earlier slide. We are working on creating the content and coordinating schedules and speakers and sponsors, preparing promotional material for this external education campaign targeting both the constituent base, general constituent base, and then a legislative audience as we continue to bring on support from the House and the Senate. We have a communications kind of working group. Prairie Rivers Network is working as our primary communications sponsor and getting a web page up for our campaign. As a part of that effort, we are finalizing updates to various informational templates. We're creating primers for the different agencies that would be implementing this bill on the various commodities implicated by the bill. We are open to discussing some name updates because deforestation free future Illinois is a little bit of a mouthful. And so if anyone is like a really great copywriter, we would welcome your snappy suggestions. And then things like social media content creation and media relations. We started identifying some potential media outlets who we'd like to get coverage from as we move into the 2025 legislative session. And so that kind of covers all of the communications working group action items. We have a legislative organizing group that the illustrious Pam on this call, I will be speaking with her next week about all of the different strategies incorporated in that working group. And some of that includes some communications materials that are catered to a legislative audience in the executive branch. It also will, of course, involve having meetings with these legislators, presenting at different caucuses, as long as we get their invitation and buy-in to present to them at the caucus meetings, as well as constituent mobilization. So if anyone has interest or experience in any of those areas, we'd love to work with you on that. We have a bunch of different research projects going on. Some of our coalition members are working on looking into the Illinois supplier list and seeing to what extent the commodities supplied by those suppliers are implicated by this bill, deforestation risk profile, or if they have a deforestation policy. We're working with the executive branch to identify what near-term impact this bill might have on the ability to procure those products, and then hopefully working with the base of suppliers to help them build deforestation-free policies within their business models. And then some additional items include getting more endorsements from grassroots and Illinois environmental groups, different commodity interest groups, and I did write this on there too, that we don't have an immediate need for fundraising support, but as we move into the next legislative session, it would be very helpful to have some funds going into some in-person organizing efforts, helping with transportation costs. And in an ideal world, we'd also be able to hire a renowned Illinois environmental lobbyist to help push this forward in the near term. And that concludes the formal part of the presentation. I'm going to go to the next slide. And this is the contact email for our campaign. I'm the one that checks this, but it will also get forwarded to Jen. Should you want to communicate with Jen or either of us, we would receive those emails. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and if there's time for people to ask questions, we're very open to that. Jeff.
Yeah, great presentation, Whitney. Thanks. In the area of beef, okay, I wanted to ask a question about that because, for example, the U.S. imports close to $1 billion worth of Brazilian beef. Those imports would be covered by this bill?
not necessarily the imports, because that is happening at the federal level, but it would, the general notion of Brazilian beef being red flagged by anyone who is procuring beef as an Illinois state entity, that would be called into question. If someone was getting Brazilian beef, for example, they would need to prove that it did not contribute to deforestation or primary forest degradation or the interrelated human rights abuses. And that has a very high deforestation risk profile. So most there would be no more Brazilian beef.
Okay, I think it's a great idea. It'll be interesting. JBS isn't going to like it. But yeah, I think it's great that your group is going after them. And palm oil also. Oil is a constituent of so many food items, cosmetic items, a lot of things like that. That's another product that would be, any palm oil containing product would also be subject to review under this bill and possible exclusion from Illinois.
That contain palm oil would be a food product. Generally, the food products are going to prisons and schools that are procured through state agencies or state methods. There was something else I wanted to say in response to that, but I'm forgetting it, of course, now. So for example, and this is a little in the weeds, but legislative offices are not generally permitted to purchase food using state funds. There's a little bit of there's some implementation areas I'm not confident that we'd be able to totally cover, because if a legislator is hosting an event and purchases food, they're usually using their campaign funds, which is a separate funding source. So the products that this procurement bill covers would be products that are being purchased using state funds and by state entities.
Mm-hmm. So, if palm oil fell under one of those criteria, then it would be subject to the terms of the bill.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. I think it's a great idea. I think you're poking a couple of hornets' nests, but I think, I think it's great to go after products like that. Thanks.
Climate organizers love a good fight.
John, you had a question?
You are next.
Yeah, I wrote down a few comments as we were going. Certainly no argument with getting this done. I think you're looking at the audience that would support it. However, I'm concerned with compliance, because as we know over the decades, greenwashing is alive and well. How do we validate? I'm not saying ask for an answer, but how do we validate the mechanism that these, in fact, are going to be positive companies for the deforestation or degradation tag? Also, our experience, climate reality is disappointment, frankly, in Illinois whenever funding is attached to anything. So many things out of CEJA, great, but there's no funding. EV rebates, we go crazy on it. It's like, why even have EV rebates if we're having $12 million for EV rebates? So it's such this wonderful thing to trumpet. Oh, Illinois got a $4,000 EV rebate, but they don't fund it. And so I'm concerned, if there's a funding mechanism on this, it needs to be tied into the bill. Otherwise, if you just say concept, I'm afraid it goes nowhere. Illinois hasn't supported ACC2 or ACT. That fell apart. So that was probably corn related. So do we have constituencies here that are going to object, and all of a sudden the legislatures are going to back off because they're going to get pushback from a beef producer, somebody else, somebody that's got a corporate office in Chicago, whatever. So I'm afraid of that scenario where when it really comes to it, it sounds good, and all of a sudden we get a little complaint and the legislature and or the governor back off. So these are kind of my notes as we went through. A couple more things, but those are my main comments and concerns.
Thanks so much, John. Yeah, all of those concerns are heard and noted, and we are having conversations about to what extent there would be a cost cost element to the implementation process, as well as different mechanisms. We have a few ideas, but we are still working through the details. Rachel, I think you were
Well, I was
next.
just gonna say, just real quick on the greenwashing piece, John, absolutely noted. And we certainly don't want to add to the litany of greenwashing mechanisms that there are. But one of the purposes of this bill is actually to take the legs out from under very long-standing greenwashing, quote unquote due diligence checkpoints. For example, third-party certification. That's sort of been the standard accepted metric for whether or not products are sustainably sourced. Particularly, my expertise is in wood products. And this moves away from that practice, which has a lot of problems, and actually requires the companies themselves to be looking at where their sourcing is coming from rather than relying on these often questionable third parties. And, similarly on the Northern Forest piece, that's all been greenwashed for a very long time. And by, directly tying that into these broader forest impacts that it's trying to curb, the hope is to open up this issue in a way that it hasn't been before. But you're absolutely right. Whenever you get a new measure in, there's a new opportunity for greenwashing, and that's something we're definitely paying attention to.
There's also something worth noting about how the EU's regulation kind of paves the way for better implementation, because a lot of these companies that have to comply with the EU regulation have to have the infrastructure now in place that prove that these products that they want to supply to the EU are not contributing to deforestation or forest degradation, and therefore all of that infrastructure is in place for the global suppliers, many of whom are also supplying products at the state level across the US. And so there's a much better momentum for implementation behind these kinds of efforts now that there is momentum for the industry as a whole to be shifting in this direction.
Rachel, you had a question?
Thanks. This is great. And if we can get the compliance and the money sorted out, yeah, yes, go, go, go. My question is about the endorsements that you listed. It looked like most of those endorsements were, environmental or climate focused groups. And I'm wondering to what extent you have already or are interested in pursuing endorsements from animal rights groups, anti-factory farming groups, groups like that haven't always been at home in the environmental movement, but there is some room for alliances, especially on this issue of beef and deforestation, beef farming.
It's a great point, Rachel. Yeah, that is. I started looking in the direction of food and farm systems, sustainable food and farming systems groups. I had not explicitly considered animal welfare, anti-factory farming groups, but that is definitely something we'll incorporate. I'll also note the coalition behind this bill has largely been involved in the bills in other states and at the federal level. And there are a number of general endorsements from major investors and other corporations that have been working toward complying with similar regulations. And so we haven't asked them to explicitly endorse the Illinois bill because it's a very heavy lift to go out and reach the many, many, many endorsers who have already signed on in support for these other efforts. But yeah, there's a broader kind of network of support than what was reflected on there. And it will definitely, if you have any suggestions for groups that fall under that category, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I can drop my email in the chat, and if somebody wants to get back to me, we can brainstorm about that.
Great, that sounds good.
Yeah, it's a great reminder, Rich. I will say two of the major sponsors, as we call them in California, were actually animal welfare organizations. So yeah, there's a huge intersection here. So that's a great reminder to broaden the tent.
Any other questions? Pam,
Deborah put a question in the chat, and I'll read it out loud. It says, how will agencies know what the impacts of the products they buy are? Does the bill specify certain certifications or have other definitions? So these are a couple of the compliance measures that I remember off the top of my head, and I can copy and paste the last version of the bill that'll be reworked to have a stronger, um, just stronger provisions than what the first version contained.
Yeah,
Essentially,
I heard you say you were working on options.
yeah. So the bill doesn't say that certifications cannot be a part of their compliance measures, but we're not going to be endorsing any particular ones. And in fact, there are
Yeah.
some that are
And I
not.
wasn't suggesting that was the answer, but you know, how are they? They're probably kind of, I can imagine the agencies sort of throwing up their hands and saying, how are we going to know?
Yeah, and they have, but in a really, really collaborative way so far. And so a lot of our conversation with the agencies so far has been hand-holding and helping run the supplier list that they've provided through a bunch of different research resources that indicate which companies are the most complicit in violating for deforestation and primary forest degradation
Yeah,
standards.
just think about the fact that that constantly changes and you need an ongoing mechanism, and it's probably best if it's not you.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yes, thank you.
Any other final comments? And Pam, you just got back from American Forest. Do you have a comment you want to make relative to this?
Oh, not related to American Forests, but I'm very supportive of this entire plan, and I would love to see Illinois be the first state to pass something. And I know it's going to take some major lifting to do it, but with the broadening of the tent, the way Rachel described, and our chapter helping and other environmental groups, you know, we can push forward. I think it'll take more than 1 year, but there's no reason not to get it started, because it's going to make a big difference for everything that Jennifer outlined. You know, climate is a biggie, and then biodiversity is equally as big. So I think it's one of those nature-based solutions areas that we really need to support.
Yeah. Okay, if there's no further questions, we'll go on to part 3 here. Link Cohen is original member of the chapter, and he's active in the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. And he's involved in steering a power sector bill for the Clean and Reliable Grid Act. And so he's involved in that process. He's also beginning a term, four-person term at the ICJC that's coordinating a committee which organizes coalition-wide meetings and performs other administrative work. Link would like to speak to us. So why don't you go ahead, Link?
Hey, let me get this together here. Let's see. There we go.
Yeah, good.
How's that?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so tonight I'd like to talk about how the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition, the ICJC, plans to move our state towards a fossil-free electric grid. And I hope to win your active support for this effort. I'm not going to read all the slides to you, so when I get done talking, I'm going to give you a little time to look at them yourself and then move on to the next one. As part of the ICJC, our chapter has been a key participant in getting climate legislation passed in the Illinois legislature. Most important was CEJA, the 2021 Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. Next on the coalition's legislative agenda is the Clean and Reliable Grid Act. That's what I'd like for us to discuss tonight. The coalition has launched a campaign with a three-part platform. Legislators have begun work on the first one, aiming for what is shaping up to be an energy bill that all the influential stakeholders can agree on. The chief sponsor of ICJC's Clean Grid Act, State Senator Bill Cunningham, is convening a legislative working group made up of all the stakeholders. Most of them have their own bills in the hopper. Among the stakeholders are representatives of the renewables industry, the battery storage industry, the utilities, of course, and nearly more than 200 groups represented by the ICJC. I'm serving on the negotiating team for the ICJC, where I'll be able to represent viewpoints of our chapter. Thanks to the activism of our chapter's members and the members of other groups in the coalition, the ICJC has shown if we strongly propose a bill in the General Assembly, we can block passage. But that doesn't mean that we can get whatever we want passed. So the legislative working group as the legislative working group moves forward, we'll be asked to make some concessions on what's in our bill. Your input will help determine which of the concessions we can live with and which we just can't. Let's look at where we are. As you can see from this graph, we're making progress, but even so, as Tom and many of our chapter's members point out, it's not nearly fast enough. So, how are we going to get this done? The limitations of our current grid mean that it's difficult to plug renewable projects into the grid. This is one of the main factors that are slowing our transition. There's a whole line of finished projects that aren't contributing to the grid because they're not able to connect. Another one of these is siting. A bill backed by the ICJC, which passed a couple of years ago, aimed at minimizing the ability of renewable opponents to stand in the way of getting land use permits for solar and wind projects. But a lot of difficulties are still around to find the right places to build. A big part of solving these problems is to build more transmission capability by putting up new towers, cables, and transformers in the right places. The ICJC bill will facilitate that by expanding who the grid operators can hire to do this construction projects. Right now, that's very limited. Just the utilities are able to do the expansion work, but our bill would allow other construction groups to do that. The foundation of Illinois' clean energy policy is the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which you often see as RPS. The RPS set by CEJA requires Illinois electric utilities to have 40% of their electric power coming from renewable resources by 2030 and 50% by 2040. But in 2023, wind and solar accounted for only 13.5%. The goal for 2025 is 25%. So to meet this, we're going to need to work fast. And one of the things we got to do is get utility scale solar projects online and get a lot of battery storage. RPS language in our bill would make it less risky for clean energy companies to develop large scale solar projects. Of course, wind and solar are both intermittent sources of power. So we'll need to pair them with battery storage to keep the lights on all the time without burning fossil fuels. Battery storage is a key to getting rid of fossil fuel generators. The cheapest energy is energy we don't use. We can't meet our RPS goals without making our electricity use more efficient. Our bill would strengthen energy efficiency provisions. One provision would require large industrial energy users to implement electric energy efficiency measures. In the chart, notice the tiny, if you can barely see it, the tiny blue bars that signify the contribution of industrial companies in doing energy efficiency. There, a little sliver down there. Right now, municipal electric utilities and co-ops don't have to meet the state's RPS targets or any other provisions of CEJA. Our bill would get them to move toward a renewable energy future. They would have to be transparent in their decision making and would be mandated to do resource planning and provide for local oversight of their operations. That would give residents in those communities a voice in where electric power comes from. You can see from the graph how they barely use renewables at all. And I know that a number of you from Naperville and some of the other villages and suburbs are covered by these municipal. So this is something that applies very much to you. In the last decade, we've focused mostly on how to reduce emissions from fossil fuel plants and in how to get the state to put clean energy policies in place. That's helping to replace uneconomic plants with cost-effective clean energy, wind, solar, energy efficiency. Our next bill will help speed this process by establishing a preference for the Illinois Power Agency to procure clean energy for the utilities to distribute whenever the cost is below or even a little more than the cost of fossil fuel energy. So IPA procures the energy that our two big, Ameren and ComEd, distribute. This would gives them some incentive to lean towards clean energy. The IPA also has to plan for peak usage times, like extreme heat in the summer, extreme cold in the winter, or other times when the regularly contracted power generators can't keep up. Battery storage and energy efficiency are parts of the solution. The ICJC bill would give ratepayers predictable time of use rate options, where electricity is cheaper at certain hours of the day. That would save customers money and reduce the use of expensive and dirty electricity from so-called peaker plants. Although subsidies for building battery storage are not in our bill, the coalition is supporting provisions of a battery storage industry bill that we favor putting into the final bill, which is, of course, going to be sausage making, as many of you understand the legislative process here in Illinois. So a little bit about what we're going to be asking people to do from the grassroots. This is what the ICJC is working for in the power sector. We'll need a lot of grassroots support to get a bill passed that can move us quickly in that direction. Modernize the grid, build renewables faster, and get them online sooner. Spend more on energy efficiency for consumers and get battery storage up and running. Train folks to do this work, especially people in places where coal and gas plants are closed and places where fossil fuel plants are doing the most damage. Remove barriers to siting for utility scale wind and solar. This is what the Clean and Reliable Grid Act has in it. And again, That's just the beginning of the conversation, but our bill is going to be the beginning of the conversation, so that's a good sign. If you live in the suburbs or downstate, you can make sure local officials facilitate clean energy projects by attending the meetings of zoning bodies, county boards, and city councils. So that's one thing that people can do in the suburbs and exurbs. Please let us know if you live in a city or village with a municipal or co-op electric utility and you'd like to get involved with the ICJC Muni Co-op Working Group. Put your contact information in the chat now with a Muni/co-op tag. And once I get off of the screen sharing, I'm going to put my email in the chat, so you can contact me with more information. So we want to know what you think. One way to express that is with this survey. So what I would like everybody to do is take your phone out, grab this the URL with this graphic and the QR code. And I don't want to take time now, but if you get the website onto your phone, then you can go back when you have a few minutes and answer the questions. We'd really appreciate that. It's really the kind of input that we need. So I think we have a few minutes if you want to offer your thoughts about the question that's posted up here now, or ask a question of your own. I'd love to know what you think, and I'll put my email in the chat. If you have any further thoughts on this crucial issue, write them down and send them to me, or email me your phone number and we can chat about it.
Dave,
and the last thing, pardon?
No, go ahead.
The last thing is to keep your eyes peeled for clean and reliable grid action alerts from us. There will be the first one soon. So
Looks like we do have a question link from David Kraft.
okay, let me get out of the sharing screen. Go ahead, Dave.
Thank you. Yeah, apparently my camera is giving me trouble tonight, so I'm turning it off.
Okay,
a couple
well,
of questions.
We like the Galaxy.
It's a good one. First of all, is there a bill number yet?
Yes. Didn't I have what? Wasn't it in the?
Maybe I missed it, but I didn't see it.
I think it was in there somewhere, Link, but I can't remember the number.
I think it's SB 3637, but let me.
We'll send the slides out.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So that brings me to the next thing. One of the important aspects, as you pointed out, is the issue of energy storage. But it seems everybody, when they hear that term, they always think of batteries. So I'm curious if the ICJC or others are looking into other alternative kinds of storage, like sand batteries, for example, that are being at least experimented with in Europe, but they're an alternative to the traditional lithium ion stuff, which people have a lot of problems with. So that's my first question. Then I have a follow-up.
Yeah, I think that we have put the burden of what the legislation, how the legislation on storage will be on the storage industry. And so I'm not sure. I think most of what the storage industry right now is people who make batteries and distribute them. I think this experimental stuff is, I'm not real familiar with it. I know there's an awful lot of experimentation on batteries and research going on, and there's a number of things that different companies and research groups are trying to do, but I don't think our bill doesn't specify battery storage at all. We're going to support